Thank you, Maizung. Thank you so much. I want to start by saying that one of the wonderful things about being a Dominican for me has been my friendship with Maizung Win for the last, 15 years or so. We've been through lots together and she's taught me so much and I hopefully have taught her a bit too. So it's really a joy for me to be here this morning, and I want to begin by saying that being a Dominican for 61 years from the time I actually started, has been a great ride for me, a really great ride. It's been tough sometimes, it's been challenging all the time, but it's been a wonderful opportunity to, I always say that being Dominican involves a relentless pursuit of God in a community of others who also have as their primary goal the relentless pursuit of God. And by God, I mean God in this incarnational way that we're talking about, as we did in the prayer. So it doesn't fit everybody. It's not a great life for everybody, but if it's the right life for you, I strongly encourage you to pursue it. So let us begin with Mary Ellen's help by going to the second slide. And just if you have a scrap of paper, just jot down your answers to these three questions, really. When was the beginning of everything? How long ago did that happen? And how long did it take to finish it? Nobody else is going to read it. It's just for your own benefit. We'll come back to it in a little bit. So as we begin to look at this question of who we are in the perspective of deep time, I think we need to start from our present experience. And next slide, please, Mary Ellen. These slides needed to be ready through Mary Ellen's expert help a week ago. So even in 1 week's time, I would not do this slide the same way. So our experience of the last 3 months in particular, but the last several years has brought us to the brink of recognizing that we're living in the midst of three catastrophes at the same time. The catastrophe of climate change was just beginning to get into human consciousness when the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic moved us toward the catastrophe of having to recognize not something new, but at a whole new level, recognizing the catastrophe of racial discrimination in our society. So we're finding ourselves in the midst of three catastrophes at the same time. And those three are very much interrelated with each other. We won't go into that now, but the force of the shattering of our reality has brought us to ask ourselves questions that we maybe haven't faced before, partly because we've had time on our hands. When everything shut down in the middle of March, we found ourselves maybe still having to go to work, but in a different way, maybe working from home, or maybe not able to work at all. But it completely undid our daily routines. And we started asking ourselves things like, what's going on? And how did we get here? And who's to blame? We do a lot of that, of course. How do we protect ourselves? How can we stop the pandemic from spreading? How can we stop the racial injustice that we're seeing right before our eyes, because now we have video capacity? What can we learn about life from these three catastrophes. What does life mean anyway? Who are we? Who are we supposed to be as human beings? Are we basically students? Are we basically consumers? That's the way TV tells us who we are. Are we basically workers? Or basically family members? Or are we more than any of these? Next slide. So how we understand ourselves as humans depends on our perspective, our lens, our worldview. We can look at ourselves from up very close. Today, in this moment, I am sitting in front of a computer screen, trying to open myself to exploring new things. We can look at ourselves as humans from a bigger perspective. Well, we're the ones who kind of run the world. Or we can look from an even bigger perspective than that. So an example of perspectives would be, move along please, Mary Ellen. We could look at this redbud tree, which is probably Kentucky's most famous tree that is just gorgeous. It's actually lavender, but we call it redbud. And it comes out at a certain time in the springtime, and it's wild everywhere, and it's also cultivated. If I had a better camera, I could have taken just one tiny blossom on one cluster of blossoms on the branch of that tree. That would be a very close-up perspective. Move on to the next. I could have stepped back with my lens and looked at the whole tree, and that would be a larger perspective on what this reality is. Or, next slide, I could move on to step back even further or zoom even farther out and look at the tree in its context, which happens to be the front lawn of the mother house of St. Catherine in St. Catherine, Kentucky. So this tree in context is a kind of an image of what we mean when we talk about deep time. Moving on, Mary Ellen. Deep time is a new perspective on humanity that nobody had 100 years ago. So the greatest geniuses in the world had no idea of who we are, really. You can think of Socrates and Plato, you can think of any of the great geniuses. Nobody knew who we really were because we did not have the science to be able to know the full picture, the big perspective, the deep time perspective. Next slide. So a deep time perspective, going back to the little notes that you wrote, when did everything begin? How long ago was that? You can look at what you said. I'd be interested if some of you might have said, well, everything began when the Bible was written. That's the story that we all have learned and lived from for 2,000 or 4,000 years in the case of the Old Testament, that the world began with the creation as the creation story tells it. And that is, in many ways, a good capturing of what humans knew about themselves. It's fairly accurate, at least in the progression of what was created first and what was next and what was next, if you read the different days of creation. But for many people, they've gotten stuck in a literal translation of that story and think that creation really happened in 7 days. And I had a young seminarian from the evangelical tradition in my office 15 years ago when I started New Pioneers, and I have a piece of creek rock from the property at St. Catherine's on a ledge in the office, and it has all these little fossils in it. And as those of you who know any geography, no, Kentucky is certainly not near an ocean. So this young man looked at it and he was admiring the fossils. And I said, pick it up and hold it, Kyle. And he picked it up. I said, you're holding 500 million years in your hands. That's from when Kentucky was under a tropical sea. And he looked at me with absolute certainty and said, oh no, this is 6,000 years ago. It came from the flood. So there are people who really see that that's how old the world is. And it's dangerous to try to change their perception. But from a scientific perspective, we now have plenty of evidence that human history began about 300,000 years ago. We didn't start writing it down until 6,000 years ago. So when we talk about history, many people think, oh, that goes back 6,000 years. Well, yeah, our history, as we've been able to begin to write it, goes back 6,000 years. But we've been here for 300,000 years on a planet that we know with some degree of certainty now scientifically is 4.5 billion years ago, and in a universe that's 14 billion years old, or 13.7, 13.8. When you get into numbers that large, a couple billion years doesn't seem to make that much difference. So moving to a deep time perspective means looking at ourselves in the context of this larger story that we now know that we didn't used to know about the evolution of the universe. Next slide, please. So a deep time perspective means recognizing an ever-evolving universe. And if we recognize an ever-evolving universe, it really changes our understanding of who we are as humans. So I didn't use the term cosmology to start with because I think that kind of intimidates a lot of people. It's not a common word. It's not something that we understand and use in a familiar way. But a cosmology simply means putting together the science that we now know with the values, the human meaning of that scientific evidence. So you can read just the science, you can learn just the science and believe that there is no spiritual reality. It's stuff. It's chemistry and biology and quantum physics, and it's all just stuff, and it's all accidental and random, and that's all there is. But a cosmology takes those scientific facts and looks at their meaning, their value, their potential from a perspective that only humans can have. As far as we can tell anyway, we as a species are the only species that has the capacity to be self-reflective. So we call it self-reflective consciousness. A deer has feeling, probably intuition, intelligence, but does a deer have the capacity to look at what it means to be deer in the perspective of this present, the past, or the future? Most likely not. Nor does that apply to any of the other species in creation. Next slide, please. So we don't have time this morning at all to go through the whole story of the evolution of the universe, but I love this image because it is in a natural place, and immediately we might think, oh, that's a labyrinth, but there are no paths in and out of the labyrinth. This is an image of the spiral unfolding from the beginning to the present. And it starts with a tiny seed, how that seed got there? We don't know. But that seed exploded forth. A lot of people call it the Big Bang. I like to call it the Great Flaring Forth, which suggests that it was this moment of incredible creativity. And over the course of millions and even billions of years, things started to happen with that creativity that we don't know how to explain. We don't know how to make sense of how it knew to do that. But we moved from gases in space, but the space itself kept expanding. Space is not like a contained thing. It keeps growing outward. Everything's in motion, and particles begin to bump into each other and cluster. And eventually we had stars, clusters of fire with planets around them. And then we had galaxies forming. And then we had hundreds of billions of galaxies, each of them made up of hundreds of billions of stars. The universe is way beyond anything that a human mind can comprehend. Way beyond. And in that entire huge, massive, incomprehensible reality developed a planet that had an amazing capacity to bring about life. Are there other planets in other parts of the universe that have the capacity to bring out life? Certainly possible, but we don't know about them yet. We only know, the human species on Earth only knows of one planet out of all of this amazing reality. One planet has the capacity to create life. And as that first cell developed, again, was it by accident and random? Hard to imagine. Something happened, that one cell developed, and that cell figured out how to multiply, and those cells together over millions of years were able to figure out how to overcome the problems that were created by their development, and on until it got to the point, way late in the process, I'll say, that a type of life, after having gone through the forms of single cell and then multi-cell and then plants and then animals, amphibians and insects and reptiles and dinosaurs and birds and mammals, over the course of millions and millions of years, came about one particular kind of mammal that had the capacity, slowly evolving, of self-reflective consciousness. Next slide. So that's what we mean when we talk about a deep time perspective, that we humans are latecomers to this incredibly, amazingly dynamic and alive creation, reality, universe, whatever word you want to use for it. When we look at ourselves from the perspective of that great flaring forth, it changes everything about our understanding of who we are. And that's what we call a deep time perspective. It's looking at not just the blossom on the tree, not just a branch, not just one tree, but the tree in the context of its largest reality. So we're oriented by the deep time perspective to our largest context, our matrix, our mother, the earth. We are transformed into a much larger identity That perspective guides our actions for creating the future, and it serves as a learning continuum throughout life. Next slide. So the context is a vast and ever-evolving universe. That's where we are. We're in motion. We're moving at 250,000 miles an hour, I think. The Earth is spinning, and that is in motion over the course of a year all the way around the sun. We're in constant motion. We're in constant change, but we don't even realize it most of the time. So our identity emerges inside of and is dependent upon. That's the key message. Our identity, our reality, our very existence is depending upon the vast evolving universe. Next slide. Our mother, the earth, the matrix, is an interdependent reality from which all life emerges, on which all life depends. We are an evolving element of earth. Chief Seattle got this a long time ago when he said, the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. But boy, do we not get that. Our human future depends on grasping this foundational understanding that we are an evolving element of earth. Earth is not an evolving element of us. We are not the ones in charge, much as we like to think we are. Indigenous people understood this. Indigenous people in all parts of the world had this innate, deep connection with, they talk about creator and spirit that exists in all beings, not just in the human. Indigenous people have that innate understanding that the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. But in this country, the European invaders killed off most of the indigenous people. So we've lost the source of wisdom we need most. Next slide. We've killed off the source of wisdom we need most. Now, there are fortunately some elements of Native American spirituality that are still available to us, but we don't pay much attention to them at all. So the universe has been transforming for 14 billion years. It's not static. It doesn't stay the same. Each of us is part of that 14 billion year flow of evolution. The same particles, this is, if you want to contemplate a mystery, contemplate this one, that the same matter that exploded from the seed 13.7 billion years ago is the stuff of which our bodies are made. That's all the stuff there is what came out of that explosion. So the cells of my body are made up of biochemicals, which literally started back at that great flaring forth. That means my reality, my being, is the same as your being. I mean, it has its uniqueness, but the stuff of everything is from the same single source. We are way more interconnected than we can ever begin to imagine. Now, we're the ones, the humans, who are uniquely gifted with the capacity to know this, to be totally in awe, to be the ones of all the species, of all the parts of creation, the ones who can wonder at all of this. The ones who should know. Our nature is made up so that we are the ones who can know that this life that we're living is incredibly, incredibly awesome. But if you're like me, you plod along day to day and you crab about the fact that it's raining and you wish you could have gotten something else at the grocery, and You wonder if your friends are mad at you. And that's the level of consciousness that we humans tend to live at most of the time. But we don't need to stay there. We also, our consciousness is evolving. And the fact that we now have this scientific information about who we are, and we've only had it for the last 50 or so years, then potentially we're on the brink of breaking through to a new amazing sense of awe and wonder. And that's part of what I think these last 3 months have helped us to move toward. Not necessarily by choice. We're getting scared about what climate change is doing. We're sure scared about what the pandemic is doing. And now with fires and violence in our streets all over the country, we're scared about what our racism is doing to our species. So there is such a thing as healthy fear. And the fact that we're scared is going to very likely help us move forward into transformation. Next slide, please. Another aspect of what's going on is that we, in this whole scientific development, our species has now evolved to the point that we can significantly impact the future evolution of the planet. We have figured out how to control things, how to change things, how to use enormous machines to scoop out a whole side of a mountain in order to get a little bit of coal for our purposes, to the point where we change the river systems, we change the air quality, we change everything about that side of that mountain. We have uncovered and discovered the secrets of the evolving nature of reality to the point that we literally are now co-creators of evolution. And I believe that's not accidental. I believe that the divine energy is so generous, so in love with this unfolding reality and with us as humans, that the divine is ready now to share the creative capacity with the human species. But we are screwing it up so bad. We can't get out of our own self-centeredness enough to look at it the way the divine energy looks at it, love it, and care for it. We're still into, I want this for me, we want this for us, we're going to take this away from them. We're still into that very adolescent, childish probably, stage of awareness where it's all about me. It's all about how I can get what I want for me and mine. And if we don't break through that self-centeredness, then we're doomed. And we are seriously in danger, especially with climate change, of not being able to live here anymore as a species. That's a reality, that's a fact. But we also are capable of making that evolutionary leap into a perspective that helps us to say, I'm going to take care of this. We're going to take care of this. We are going to step back from our selfishness and move into another whole approach to reality. Next slide, please. So part of what we're about as people of goodwill all through the planet, as a species throughout the planet, is figuring out how to act differently. We need to learn how to participate consciously in evolution to create a vibrant world. We need to, in order to get there, we need to really deepen the contemplative aspect of who we are. Not just as religious people, not just as Christian people, as human beings. If we don't learn how to go inside of ourselves and discover what's in there, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, we will not be able to make this transformation. And then, of course, the on-the-ground problem solving. Next slide. So the continuum is to continue to learn. And I've been aware of this deep time perspective. Some people call it the universe story, the journey of the universe. Some people call it big history. Some people call it the new story of creation. There are a lot of different names for it. I've been aware of it for 30 years, but I am only on the smallest edge of really getting it. And it's a generational evolutionary process. None of us is going to figure this all out this week and change our lives drastically. We have to do it one step at a time. But we do need to continue the learning. And then what our generation, your generation learns, then becomes a new cosmology, which we pass on to the next generation, hopefully better than we received it. And they pass it on to the next generation, hopefully better than they received it. Next slide, please. So I went to a camp run by a friend of mine several years ago. It was a summer camp intended to teach children this story of the universe. And as a visitor, my friend who was the teacher said to the children, can you all tell Sister Claire, what does it mean to be human? And this little kid, freckle-faced, redheaded kid in the front row stands up and he says, with all his heart, well, we're the ones who can stand up on our two hind legs and look all around, and say, wow. And that has stayed with me from whatever it was, 20, 25 years ago. That is what it means to be human. If you want to talk about Dominican mission, that's what it means to be a Dominican. That's what it means to be a Christian, or a Jew, or a Hindu, or a Buddhist, or an atheist, if that's your choice. But it's the capacity of the human is to stand up on our two hind legs, look all around, and exclaim, wow. So my son asked me to put together some things that you might do over these next 3 hours that might help to integrate, concretize, help you grapple more with the kinds of things that we've been talking about. So these are my suggestions. You don't have to do any of them. You might have a much better idea yourself, but my suggestions are go out and take a walk for about a half an hour. Now, if it's pouring rain, you might have to walk inside your house, but see if you can move around. We've been sitting still for too long. But look around, whatever environment you're in. Look around as if it's the first time you have ever arrived here. And ask yourself, what would change if you started believing, I mean really believing, that you are literally and physically made of stardust? What would change if you started believing that you're a part of an expanding universe, still expanding, made up of billions of galaxies, each of which has billions of stars, and all of it's moving, it's all in motion? What impact would that have on you? Next slide, please. What would change if you started believing that your planet, your Mother Earth, is a living ecosystem, one living ecosystem, composed of trillions of beings, all of whose lives and health depend upon each other, as well as we all depend on the quality of the air, the water, the land, the mountains, the trees, the entire natural world. What would change in you if you started believing that? And what would change if you came to terms with and really accepted that your really big, most important role as a human is to be one who stands up regularly on your hind legs, looks all around, not just at Earth, but at that expanding universe, and says, wow, how would your life change? Next slide, please. So if you want to, after you walk, you might spend some time writing, journaling about what difference that would make. You might ask yourself, how could the reality, this, I'm sure you sort of knew before, but if you've deepened in your perception and understanding of the meaning of it, how could that reality make a difference in your ministry, whatever your ministry is in the world, and how would that reality impact your relationship with God? And then one more slide. This is another option that I think could be fun. Think of a child that you know and love and invent a story appropriate to their particular age level that would help them to get clear about where they came from, where they come from. Most of them know they came out of their mummy's tummies, but where did they really come from? Who are they in the universe? And how they can, in their childish way, image God in relationship with all of this. Try to make your story interesting and exciting so a child would really benefit from it. And if you happen to have a child handy before your next session this afternoon, try it out on them and see what you learn. So those are some suggested activities, but as I said, whatever you choose to do with this next 2 to 3 hours is just fine. Is that the end of the slides? Oh, then there's the references to Brian Swim and Thomas Berry and the video that I mentioned.